And as we said, we have DW News Africa anchor Christine Mundwa with us here in our studio. You're from Zimbabwe, and we should say you were in Harare to cover Mugabe's ouster in 2017. So a lot to talk about there. But first, let's watch a clip from back then, November 21st, 2017.
People are chanting things like, Robert Mugabe, you had sold this country. They are looking to Emerson Mnangagwa, who is most likely going to take the reins for the foreseeable short term, perhaps even further. But people aren't talking about the future right now. They're talking about the moment.
Christine, look at those images of pure celebration there on the streets in 2017. What did that moment mean to you as a Zimbabwean?
Sumi, I was born in Zimbabwe, and when I was young, our family moved over the border to South Africa. A few years after that, it became very clear that we were never going to go back to Zimbabwe. There was never going to be a life for us there. I grew up hearing tales of how difficult life was. You know, cousins would call and tell us how hard things are. My parents made the toss-up of going to Zimbabwe, spending money on the trip versus giving the money to relatives who desperately needed it. You know, I was listening when we had the HIV epidemic breakout, where people died because of not being able to access medicine, family members. We lost a lot of relatives. So I'm standing there, and I had never thought, it had never occurred to me in my life, even in my reporting life, that there would be a day Mugabe would resign, that Mugabe would be alive and not president of Zimbabwe. So that I shot seconds after hearing the news that Mugabe had resigned, and I could remember just being in a state of shock, not believing what I was saying, and people around me celebrating the news that this man had gone. And for me, it felt like this is it now for this country, that this was the person who was standing in the way of this country being the prosperous nation that I had been told by my parents it used to be, that this was the breadbasket, that that there was no one hungry in Zimbabwe, that there was freedom and no oppression, at least in the early years of Mugabe. So I thought, well, is this it now? Is this the Zimbabwe that maybe I can live in now and then really own my country? So that was what was there. Of course, we sit here today and we know that's a different story, Sumi, but that was what that moment was like. And certainly that's what those people who were around me felt like.
Those people around you, we should say, were mostly young people. And Privilege touched upon this as well, this perhaps generational divide on how people see Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. What can you say about that?
It is just that. You know, I was on the phone this morning with my uncle. He's in his late 60s. He said to me, Christine, it's a sad day for Zimbabwe. We've lost our hero. That's who he talks about. When I say Mugabe the dictator, he doesn't know who I'm talking about. When I say Mugabe the oppressor, he disagrees with that narrative altogether, because he says the freedoms I have today, the pride I have as a black man, Mugabe gave to me. So you do have the people who lived in Rhodesia, so to say, who saw Mugabe come in and liberate them. You know, my mum was telling me this morning, she remembers people dying at a stampede in a stadium. Mugabe had come back from Mozambique, and people just wanted a glance of this man. This is who these people remember, that hero, the person who liberated them. Then you have young people, some of them who, by the way, I mean, in these 34 years in power, only knew the latter of his years, the difficulty. They didn't even know the better years in the beginning when he came in. So it is very much so. It's also a bit of an urban-rural divide. You go to Zimbabwe in the rural areas and you talk about Mugabe, it's almost as if they're living in another generation. It's almost a different country. That is Mugabe country, stronghold. Those are the people who will kill for Mugabe because they believe in what he did. And he was very sure to look after them. In the rural areas, you know, people have their patches of land and they grow their tomatoes. And they say, this is because of Mugabe. In the urban areas, young people struggling for jobs, graduates who come out of university and there's no prospects for them, they are very much quickly critical of this president. So it is that. It is a generation divide, but it's also a rural-urban divide.
What about actually looking at what his legacy was, you know, besides the generational divide? We heard a sentence earlier, this is the man who presided over the decline of one of Africa's most prosperous economies. Is that fair?
That's the truth, Sumi. That is the reality. Mugabe was president when Zimbabwe's economy freefalled, when we saw a currency that became a joke. I mean, in textbooks today, economic students study what inflation is, where you are holding $1 trillion note in your hand. That is what Zimbabwe became under Mugabe. And, you know, depending on who you're talking to, the narrative they offer you is different. People who support Mugabe are quick to forgive him and say, look, everything that happened is because the West reacted to how Mugabe stood up to them. So even across the continent, he's revered as our great leader, the one who stood up for Africa against the West. And they punished him for it. And that's the narrative that they give. But that's just the reality, Sumi. People suffered under Mugabe. He was president and people were hungry and died.
And how have things been since he left office?
Well, this is it, Sumi. In 2017, when we heard he'd resigned, people came out onto the streets celebrating, and they said, things are going to be better now. Mugabe is gone. Today, not so much. Not long ago, people were back on the streets protesting against the president who's in office now. The police came out, they fired at people, people died, people were injured. It's almost as if nothing changed.